occurred to me just this morning that two teams at the weekend had shock but no less deserved success in a particular race, one in Formula 1 and one in the World Endurance Championship, and both of those teams were French. As mentioned in Monday's video, which was a reaction to the events of the weekend's Formula 1 festivities, Alpine got a 2-3, which was a massive boost to their Constructors' Championship hopes, leaping them from 9th and potential ridicule at the end of the season to 6th, capitalising where everybody else around them had an absolute howler. But at the same time, over in the World Endurance Championship, that will just be called the WEC from now on and not WEC, Peugeot finally got a podium in hypercar. Peugeot getting a podium in the WEC has been a long time coming. Even if you're not remotely interested in the category, you'll have seen that Peugeot's last year ran in hypercar with this innovative design that had no rear wing. And if you haven't seen the car, what rock are you living under? But anyway, the Peugeot doesn't have a rear wing, or didn't have a rear wing, because the technical boffins behind the 9X8 made what they called a technical breakthrough that allowed the company to build their hypercar in such a way that it didn't need a rear wing, because of the way the hypercar regulations work. The hypercar regulations are less restrictive in terms of body design compared to the old LMP1 rules, so Peugeot could get the rear downforce from the diffuser and the underside of the car instead of popping a massive wang on the back. And it would show how the new rules allowed for all the manufacturers to have their own distinctive silhouettes, with Peugeot sticking out a tiny bit more. And this wasn't something just to grab headlines either. They actually raced this wingless car last season. Now, however, the Peugeot has got a wing on the back. It was sort of necessity. There'd been a regulation change and it was kind of sad, given that the Peugeot had been on course for a podium in Qatar earlier this year before they stuck the wing on. Peugeot had realised that the regulation changes, plus changes with balance of performance, had made the potential gains from a wingless car untenable, and now they had to put a wing on to get the aero balance right. But it's still a cool looking car. But back in the 90s and into the early 2000s, Peugeot was involved in Formula 1, but for whatever reason they couldn't reach the same lofty heights as their counterparts, Renault. So what went wrong? Did anything go wrong? And how did it go wrong if it did go wrong? Well, let's try and figure all that out. It doesn't take a genius to realise that from late 1991 to the end of 1997, a Renault engine was the engine to have. A Renault-powered car won the Constructors' Championship in 92, 93, 94, 95, 96 and 97, before Renault withdrew from Formula 1 and Mercedes, partnered with McLaren, started making more gains to start to challenge Ferrari, most notably on the reliability front. The Mercedes might have been more powerful in 1997, but the Renault was more reliable, and that's what matters. See the 2005 McLaren. Powerful, rapid, but blew up too many times. All those engine change penalties Raikkonen got scuppered his championship aspirations. But Peugeot was also in the sport, starting from 1994. At the end of 1992, Honda had withdrawn from Formula 1, citing the fact that they'd done what they wanted to do, but mostly because of the Japanese recession around that time. Recession also being the reason they pulled out at the end of 2008. And by the time they pulled out in 1992, they'd won 72 Grand Prix to Williams, Lotus and McLaren. Their main customer was McLaren, who were going to struggle with underpowered Ford engines through 1993. McLaren actually had a pretty decent car, all things considered, in 1993. It had traction control, active suspension and other driver aids on board, and it ended up being more advanced than the Williams come the end of the season. But the underpowered engine left a lot to be desired. A few more horsepower and Senna walks the title, because Prost and Hill's driving style didn't match well with the active cars that needed to be lobbed around the track to get the most out of them. McLaren could have struck a deal with Lamborghini to run V12s through 1994, but instead, they signed with Peugeot. The deal with Peugeot was done late. Very late. These days, with how complicated and expensive these engines are, manufacturers announce their intention to enter Formula 1 years in advance. Audi, for instance, Ford, who are coming in with Red Bull. But in the 1990s and before, a team could be told late in the season they weren't going to be getting engines anymore and could strike up a brand new deal with a company not already supplying and get new engines in time for winter testing. And by winter testing, I mean the testing they did between October and Christmas, rather than just before the start of the next season. Peugeot did seem like a good choice for McLaren, and people at the time were expecting Peugeot to have a good go of things. This was the company that, under the direction of Jean Todt, had been resurrected from ruin in the last 10 years. The 205 GTI had been a success and is now one of the most sought-after hot hatchbacks in the world, and the mid-engine four-wheel drive 205 T16 was a big part of the Group B rally years. And if you want one of the road-going ones, be prepared to part with £250,000 for a good one. And Peugeot had enjoyed some success in endurance racing quite recently, as well as in the 80s, breaking a record. Sort of. I mean, it wasn't Peugeot, but it was a Peugeot engine, but either way, Peugeot was behind this record. Peugeot entered Formula 1 off the back of 2 successive Le Mans victories. The Group C era was over, and the World Endurance Championship was in a state of trying to find some way of replacing those beloved sports cars. But Peugeot's 905B had won in 1992 and 1993, and the cars in question had been powered by a 3.5-litre V10. Coincidentally, Formula 1's regulations permitted 3.5-litre V10s. It's almost like the FIA had gone, oh, it works in Formula 1, so let's use it in endurance championships as well. You know, there's a bit of crossover there, and teams can enter endurance or they can enter Formula 1. The choice is theirs. They don't have to make a whole new engine. But I've done a video on that already. And it's a car powered by a Peugeot engine that set the fastest ever speed on the Mulsanne Straight at Le Mans. The target was 400 kilometers an hour, and the car was called Project 400. 400 kilometers an hour is 250 miles an hour, just for reference. The car hit 407 kilometers an hour, but Peugeot took that as 405 and then used it to market the car of the same name. So with all that out of the way, essentially what Peugeot was doing with McLaren was lifting an engine out of one car, modifying it, and then dropping it into the MP49. But problems were already arising. As is often the case with some of these manufacturers, they want a driver of the same nationality as their company in the car, or at least put one of their boys in the car. Toyota sticking Cristiano Di Matta into one of their F1 cars after he won kart, or Audi picking up Hulkenberg recently. Peugeot wanted Philippe Alliot in the car, but Ron Dennis wanted Martin Brundle, who he believed was more consistent and knew the sport better, as well as being a good partner for Mika Hakkinen, who was in his first full season with the team. Alliot, as a compromise, was offered the role of test driver, and he did actually get to race at the Hungarian Grand Prix of 1994 after Hakkinen was banned because of the pile-up he'd caused at the German Grand Prix. The belief was that because Renault was so good in the Williams cars, and Senna now being in one of those Williams cars, Peugeot would want to commit heavily to avoid embarrassment. But while Senna was on pole for the season-opening Brazilian Grand Prix, the Peugeot-powered McLarens were 8th and 18th, and it was being outdone by the Ford V8s in the Benettons, which had less power. And then there was the issue with reliability. It's almost like grabbing an engine designed for endurance racing and essentially lobbing it into a sprint racing car with a few modifications doesn't work. In the opening 9 races, Hakkinen could only finish 2. And on both of those finishes he had finished on the podium, so at least points were on the board. Brundle finished only 3 of the opening 9, but to be fair to Peugeot, not all the retirements were their fault. The most spectacular of the Peugeot engine failures through 1994 was at Silverstone, when Brundle's car exploded in a plume of smoke and flames within about a second and a half of the lights going green. Ron Dennis, meanwhile, was wondering what the hell he was doing, because in 1992, 93 and 94 he'd been through 3 different engine suppliers, and he was thinking, well, Peugeot was supposed to be offering me factory support, but I'm not getting it. So when Mercedes came along saying, hey, we're going to do this, 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 this and this with you, and give you a lot of money to be able to get better, Ron took the opportunity. He dumped Peugeot off, signed a deal with Mercedes, and, well, the rest was history. Peugeot, meanwhile, went and supplied Jordan. For Eddie, the reasoning was simple. He had Hart engines and needed something tiny bit better. Peugeot being a bigger company might mean better engines, and for Peugeot it meant they could make their engines better without their performances being under the microscope because of who they were working with. It was win-win-win, because McLaren got Mercedes, and Mercedes money, Jordan got Peugeot, and Peugeot got a place to make things right, for want of a better phrase. Irvine and Barrichello scored a podium at the Canadian Grand Prix, and the reliability seemed to be a bit better, but it still wasn't great. Jordan would finish just behind fellow privateers Ligier in the championship, but a good amount of points ahead of Footwork, who were using Hart engines. For reference, Jordan's improvement between 1994 and 1995 hadn't really been an improvement. They'd actually dropped down a position in the standings and lost a couple of points. So for all intents and purposes, they performed, well, pretty much the same. They just got an extra podium. For 1996, though, Jordan had high expectations. Martin Brundle, who had been in Jordan's junior team, came in as some experience as Irvine went to Ferrari, and Eddie was expecting more from the team and from Peugeot. As Eddie said on the 1996 season review tape that I must have watched 9 billion times, he'd won everything in the juniors and had been 2nd and 3rd in Formula 1. He'd got pole position, he'd got the fastest lap, but he wanted a win. And with Peugeot's resources and now the Benson and Hedges money coming in, it was time for Jordan to go from midfielder to challenging for wins. But while Peugeot had got most of the gremlins out of the engine, the car itself was a dog. Martin Brundle's words, not mine, and they went without a podium. But they were still able to get 5th in the Constructors at the expense of Ligier, who, despite winning the Monaco Grand Prix, didn't score that many other points-paying finishes. Jordan were way more consistent and ended up with 22 points, so around the same amount of points they'd got in the previous 2 years. Barrichello's 4th places at Argentina and Silverstone and Brundle's 4th at Monza were the high points, but they were finishing more races than they had been finishing before, so there was reason to be optimistic on Peugeot's end. Through 1997 though, Eddie's chase for a victory was starting to get to him, and despite having a decently powerful engine, one of the most powerful engines on the grid in 1997, driver errors and reliability with the car were getting in the way of his goals. As someone mentioned on one of my other videos, Jordan probably should have done a lot better in 1997, but they did get 3 podiums. Fisichella at Canada and Belgium, and Ralph got 3rd at Argentina, with Fizzy also getting the fastest lap in Spain. It has to be said that the retirement for Ralph in Spain was the only time the Peugeot engine gave up on them. But political pressure from the French government meant that Peugeot had to ditch Jordan to join up with Prost, making an all-French team. But just days before Alain was set to sign the deal with Peugeot, the terms of the contract changed, and Prost was no longer going to be getting engines for free. He'd have to pay for them, and there was going to be no turning back because Mugen Honda, the previous supplier, had gone to, ironically, Jordan. The deal was supposed to be free engines for 5 years, but Peugeot was making them pay for engines over a 3-year period instead. As mentioned, Prost had no choice but to sign as there was no time to find another supplier and the sponsors already on board might pull out. The 1998 season can only be described as a disaster. Prost scored only 1 point in 1998, and that was scored by Trulli at the same race where Damon Hill had won with a car powered by the same engine that Prost had just given up. The performance of Prost in that season was so bad that Olivier Panis finished bottom of the championship standings, behind Tyrrell's Teranosuke Takagi and Riccardo Rosset, who were a meme team driving a meme car that failed to qualify on a couple of occasions, and commentators were making comments on whether or not Rosset should even be in Formula 1 to start with. So what then happened is that there was a snowball effect that started gathering momentum. Prost was paying for engines that it was struggling to afford, and that was money that could have been spent on upgrading the car. The Peugeot engine wasn't terrible, it was just okay. But the Prost chassis was rubbish, and that wasn't helping things. The car at some races did look competitive, with Panis starting 3rd at his home Grand Prix in Manicourt, but he ended up going backwards, and while they did score a couple of points in the early part of the season, their best day of the year was at the chaotic race at the Nürburgring, where Trulli finished 2nd ahead of Barrichello and then behind race winner Johnny Herbert. Looking at their retirements for the year, Panis at Monaco, Trulli at Hockenheim and Suzuka, and both cars in Malaysia with Trulli no starting, were to do with the engine. Most of the issues for Prost in 1999 were gearbox related. Trulli's engine blow at Hockenheim could have happened to anybody really, so it's not exactly Peugeot to blame. Well, at least on the reliability front, they were still charging Prost for engines, which, like already mentioned, was money they could have put elsewhere. But by the end of the year 2000, the relationship between Peugeot and Prost completely evaporated. Well, no, it vaporised, and it was basically the death knell for Alain's team. 11 out of 34 classified finishes was all Prost could muster in that season. That's 34 finishes because 2 cars on a team. 11 out of 17 is a great season for a midfield privateer, but 11 spread out over the course of 34 possible finishes the 2 cars could take is woeful. Prost blamed the Peugeots for being underpowered, but Heidfeld and Alesi said it was the car that was the problem because it was inconsistent in what it wanted to do and the traction sucked. Peugeot even went as far as to debunk Prost's claims by sticking the engine on a dyno, and it returned 792 horsepower, which was actually pretty competitive for the time. Heidfeld retired in Brazil, Silverstone, Montreal and Spa with engine issues, while Alesi retired from Indianapolis and Suzuka with engine problems. As such, they finished plumb last in the standings, behind Minardi, who had been more reliable and had been able to score a better result over the course of the season. At the end of the 2000 season, Prost's major sponsors such as Gaulois, Yahoo, Bic, Agfa and so on all jumped ship, and Peugeot did as well. 115 races, and while they got a smattering of podiums, they didn't win a single championship. They couldn't even win a race. The 2000 season with Prost is in stark contrast to how they were doing elsewhere, because in 2000 they'd won the WRC with the 206, and actually my first car was a 2000 Peugeot 206. But it wasn't strictly the end of Peugeot in Formula 1. The engines and their blueprints were bought by a consortium of Asian companies headed up by Enrique Scalabroni, who had worked for Dallara, Williams and Lotus and was part of the Peugeot team that won Le Mans in 1992 and 1993. But here's where it gets interesting, because when Scalabroni was at Peugeot in 1992 and 1993, when they won Le Mans, he was working for Jean Todt, of all people. Now, Jean Todt was trying to put together a plan to enter Formula 1 with Peugeot, but Peugeot wouldn't give him the money to be able to go ahead with this project. So Ferrari came knocking, and Jean Todt went to Ferrari, and we all know what happened there. Scalabroni, meanwhile, went to Williams in 1998 and he was sent to look after the Renault Laguna BTCC cars that at the time were the reigning champions. But in 1999 he left his consultancy job at Williams and started putting together this project with these Asian businesses that was basically going to buy the remains of Peugeot's operation once they left Formula 1. The company was called, quite simply, Asiatech, and they operated out of Peugeot's old factory with its old personnel, so very few, if any, people lost their jobs. The company later expanded into the old Williams factory that was building the Renault Laguna British touring cars when Renault withdrew from the category at the end of the 2000 season and ended the Super Touring era. And they then started supplying these rebadged Peugeot engines to Arrows, who themselves were struggling. Arrows had the Asiatech engines for 2001, and Asiatech was supplying the team for free after Tom Walkinshaw had seen that Supertech had been bought by Renault, and he was worried about having to pay for Renault engines that he probably couldn't afford because, as mentioned, Arrows was in a bit of trouble. The engines were free but had reliability problems that had carried over from the previous season, with Verstappen barely able to do a lap in testing. But at least this time the team getting Prost's old engines didn't do better this time, because Arrows was only able to score a single point through lack of development. Prost, now using Acer badged Ferrari engines, managed to score a few extra points, but it wasn't enough to save them. Meanwhile, Arrows couldn't make good on the fact they weren't spending money on engines. Funds were drying up, and realising that they needed something as a Hail Mary to try and rescue some performance, they went back to Cosworth. They had to pay for the engines, but maybe paying for the engines was a risk they could take to try and get back the performance, if you follow me, but Arrows ultimately collapsed midway through the 2002 season, by which point Minardi were now the sole users of Asiatech engines, and they managed a shock 5th place at the 2002 Australian Grand Prix with Mark Webber. But like Arrows, at the end of the season, Minardi had switched to Cosworth engines because they were a bit more drivable in their performance and were easier to design the car around. So what happened to Asiatech then? They were there, but then they weren't. The company folded at the end of 2002. There was talk of them supplying Jordan, but that never went through. Then there was talk of them buying the Jordan team outright. This was because Honda was going to be the supplier of BAR, and that left Eddie without engines. Eddie went back to Ford, and the talks of Asiatech taking over were ended because the funding had been pulled. The person funding the company was allegedly the heir to the Sony company or something along those lines. Asiatech did design a Formula 1 car, and they had a model ready to go for a wind tunnel test, but as far as I can tell, it was never tested. Peugeot might be second only to Toyota in terms of lack of success for the amount of money they put in. 115 races and no wins. So, yeah, actually, Toyota might be more useless. Ford, Ferrari, Mercedes, Renault and Honda are right up there at the top, and then right down at the bottom, Peugeot and Toyota. So what went wrong for the French manufacturer? From what I can tell is that they fell into the same trap that Toyota did. Fix problems by spending a lot of money, which is not how you fix things in Formula 1. You throw money at the brains to come up with some sort of innovative solution, which is something that Peugeot didn't do. What you do is come up with a cost-effective solution that doesn't break the bank, which is something that Peugeot didn't do. 1994 should have been a learning year, and maybe they should have used a brand new engine instead of the older one, but given the time they had to supply McLaren, it probably wasn't a viable option. Peugeot had promised McLaren factory support that they never got, and Peugeot never properly recovered from that. Going to Jordan started to show some promise towards the end, but they went to supplying Prost, who had got their own problems with regards to promises that never materialised, plus Peugeot changing the rules of engagement just before the deal was due to start was kind of the thing that kicked it all off, for Prost and for Peugeot. So it does make you wonder then, what if Jean Todt had got that project signed off? There is probably an alternate universe where Jean Todt is the head of a Peugeot Formula 1 team and he works the same magic that he did with the 205 T16 and, obviously, Ferrari, but with Peugeot. They might have a few Formula 1 victories, they might even have a championship, but it's a fun thing to think about, isn't it? So then, a look at Peugeot's rubbish time in Formula 1, only bettered in terms of worseness by Toyota. If this is something that's given you some insight into days gone by, then do like the video so I know I did a good job. And for more like this, get subscribed with the bell on so you never miss out on anything else I do around here. Massive thanks as ever go out to the fine folk at Patreon for the continued support, and if you want to help keep the lights on around here, a link to Patreon is in the description, along with links to Discord, socials and other bits and pieces you might want or need to know. Well, there's super thanks if you want to top up my coffee cup, and memberships if Patreon isn't your thing but you still want to do that kind of thing, if you follow me. So until next time, I've been AdmiralLaWind, have a great day wherever you are, and goodbye.